The scent of metallic blood and ozone always lingered longer than the expensive sandalwood cologne Seo-jun sprayed to mask it. He stepped into the foyer of his penthouse at 3 a.m., the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that usually brought him a cold, sterile peace. But tonight, the air in the penthouse didn't carry its usual vacuum-sealed stillness. Through the hushed, museum-like corridors, he heard a sound that didn't belong in a fortress of glass and steel. A soft, rhythmic hum, vibrating gently against the polished marble walls. It was a melody without words, ancient and steady, cutting through the silence of his kingdom. Seo-jun paused at the threshold of the nursery, his hands instinctively hovering near the holster tucked beneath his charcoal blazer. He had spent his 34 years looking at people as nothing more than chess pieces, soldiers to be deployed, enemies to be neutralized, and staff to be ignored. Naomi Rivers had always been part of the latter. To him, she was a ghost in a dark turtleneck, an invisible force who made the dust disappear and kept the twins' nursery smelling of lavender and warmth. She was a line item in a monthly ledger, a name on a background check he had glanced at for exactly 3 seconds before signing. He had hired her for her silence and her lack of ties to the Seoul underworld. He had never expected her to be the one thing his empire couldn't produce, a soul. He pushed the door open, expecting to see the mechanical glow of the baby monitors and the silent rising and falling chests of his heirs. Instead, the Shadow King felt a jagged crack form in his porcelain armor. He didn't see a servant performing a task. He saw a sanctuary he hadn't authorized. The floorboard groaned under his Italian leather shoes. Naomi's eyes snapped open instantly, but she didn't jump or scream. She remained perfectly still, her body acting as a human-weighted blanket for the 2 small lives tucked against her sides on the circular rug. "You're late, Mr. Park," she whispered. Her voice was low, like velvet dragged over gravel, devoid of the shaking terror most people exhibited when he entered a room. Seo-jun didn't look at his watch. His gaze was fixed on Ji-woo's tiny, translucent fist wrapped firmly around Naomi's thumb. The negotiations ran over. "They missed you," Naomi said, her amber eyes locking onto his with a quiet boldness. "But they weren't alone. They haven't been alone all night." Seo-jun tightened his grip on his cuffs, the platinum signet ring on his pinky catching the amber nightlight. "I pay you to clean and oversee the staff, Naomi, not to sleep on the floor like a common guard." "I don't sleep here because I'm tired, sir," she replied, slowly disentangling herself and rising with a grace that felt ancient. She adjusted her charcoal scrubs, standing her ground despite the lethal aura radiating from his lean frame. "I sleep here because they cry when the house is too quiet. They don't like the silence you live in. They're afraid of the cold in this room." "This room is climate controlled to the degree," Seo-jun snapped, his voice a low hiss. "The air is warm, Mr. Park," Naomi said, stepping closer until the scent of her cocoa butter moisturizer vied with the smell of his gunpowder. "But the house is freezing. You should try being a father instead of a landlord sometime." Seo-jun remained frozen as Naomi brushed past him to head toward the kitchen, her shoulder grazing his arm, a sudden electric spark of human heat in a life defined by ice. He looked down at the twins, Ji-woo and Ji-ya, their black tufts of hair messy against the sage-green blankets. Slowly, his hand, the same hand that had signed cleanup orders earlier that evening, descended into the crib's light. His fingers trembled as he touched Ji-ya's velvet cheek. For the first time, he didn't see the future of the Park Syndicate. He saw 2 helpless girls who knew the touch of a stranger better than the touch of their creator. In the doorway, Naomi stopped, her silhouette framed by the hallway light, watching the most dangerous man in Seoul realize he was a pauper in his own home. The morning light in the penthouse was as cold as a surgical blade, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seo-jun stood in the center of his vast living area, his eyes fixed not on the skyline, but on the centerpiece of his breakfast table. Nestled inside a hand-delivered porcelain bowl, resting where his morning espresso should have been, sat a single black lotus. Its petals were unnaturally dark, velvet thick, and dripping with a crimson fluid that wasn't ink. The metallic tang of fresh blood filled the air, a silent scream in a house that was supposed to be a fortress. Seo-jun's heart hammered a rhythmic war drum against his ribs, though his face remained a mask of carved stone. The Black Lotus was the calling card of the Elder Council, a signal that his time of independent rule was being questioned. But how had they breached his security? He had spent millions on biometric scanners, motion sensors, and a hand-picked security detail. His mind raced, sifting through his staff like a deck of cards, looking for the joker. Was it the chef? The driver? His eyes drifted toward the nursery door. Then he thought of Naomi. She was the only one who moved through the house like a shadow, the only one who could bypass the alarms without tripping a single laser. Paranoia, a familiar old friend, coiled around his throat. In his world, innocence was usually just a well-maintained disguise. "Don't touch it," Seo-jun barked as Naomi entered the room, her tray of warm bottles in her hands. She stopped, her amber eyes shifting from the grim flower to the vein pulsing in his forehead. She didn't look afraid, she looked annoyed. "I wasn't going to. It's ruining the table's finish." "Who brought this in?" He stepped toward her, his shadow looming over her smaller frame. "Who did you let into this house while I was sleeping?" Naomi set the tray down with a deliberate, slow click. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No one came in, Mr. Park. Your guards have been at the door all night. If you're looking for a traitor, stop looking at the woman who was up at 4 a.m. changing Jia's diapers." "It's a death threat, Naomi," he hissed, grabbing her wrist, not to hurt her but to anchor himself. "In my world, this means the blood is already on the floor." "Then change your world," she whispered, her voice cutting through his panic. "Because right now, you're so busy looking for enemies that you're acting like one to the people who actually live here." Seo-jun released her wrist, the heat of his skin lingering on his palm like a brand. He turned back to the Black Lotus, only to realize the crimson fluid had leaked onto a small, hand-knit baby blanket Naomi must have left on the table earlier. The sight of the blood soaking into the soft, sage-green wool made his stomach churn. He looked up and saw Naomi standing by the nursery door, her hand on the handle, her eyes filled with a terrifyingly calm resolve. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was the last line of defense. As the sun hit the black petals, Seo-jun realized the threat wasn't just to his throne. It was a hunt, and his daughters were the prize. The hum of the industrial refrigerator was the only pulse left in the penthouse. At 2 a.m., the city below was a blur of neon veins, but inside, the air was thick with chamomile and the lingering, ghostly ozone of Seo-jun's frantic security sweep. He stood in the darkened kitchen, the silhouette of his lean frame reflected in the polished obsidian countertops. He wasn't holding a weapon, but a glass of neat whiskey, his knuckles white as he stared into the amber liquid, searching for a clarity that continued to elude him. The Black Lotus from the morning had been incinerated, its ashes flushed away, but the rot it represented remained. Seo-jun felt the walls closing in. He had spent the last 6 hours reviewing grainy security footage, firing 3 guards, and screaming at his underboss until his throat was raw. Every shadow in the corner of his eye was a hitman. Every creak of the building was a breach. He found himself drifting toward the kitchen, driven by a thirst that whiskey couldn't quench. He felt like a ghost haunting his own palace. He thought of the twins sleeping fitfully in the next room, and then he thought of Naomi. He had tried to find a reason to suspect her, some flaw in her history, a hidden contact, a lie. But there was nothing. She was a void in his records and a constant in his home. His paranoia told him she was the most dangerous element in the house because she was the only one he couldn't control with fear. A soft click of the light switch bathed the kitchen in a dim, recessed glow. Naomi stood there, her honey-brown braids loose for the first time, cascading over the shoulders of an oversized sweater. "Whiskey for breakfast, Mr. Park?" she asked, her voice a quiet rasp that didn't bother to hide her exhaustion. "It's still tonight," he replied, his voice sounding brittle even to his own ears. "Why are you out of bed?" "Ji-woo is teething. She needs a cold compress." Naomi walked toward the freezer, her movements fluid and purposeful. She ignored the lethal tension radiating from him, moving through his personal space as if he were just another piece of expensive, cold furniture. I'm doubling the detail, Seo-jun said suddenly, the words tumbling out of a need to assert dominance. Starting tomorrow, no one enters or leaves without a full body scan, not even you. Naomi stopped with her hand on the freezer handle. She turned slowly, her amber eyes reflecting the dim lights like a forest fire at dusk. You think more metal is going to keep that black flower out? You think a scanner can catch a heart that's already decided to betray you? I think I'm doing what's necessary to protect my blood, he snapped, the whiskey splashing over the rim of his glass. Naomi stepped closer, crossing the invisible line he used to keep the world at bay, her gesture a calculated risk. You talk about blood like it's a currency, but you haven't looked at them, not really. I see them every day, he hissed. No, she said, her voice dropping to a devastatingly soft whisper. You look at them and see a legacy. You see the next Shadow King in small shoes. But have you looked into their eyes when they wake up in the middle of the night? Have you seen who they're looking for? Seo-jun remained silent, his jaw tight. They have your eyes, Naomi continued, her gaze piercing through his mask. But there's a difference. Their eyes are still searching for a reason to trust the world. Yours are just looking for a reason to burn it down. If you don't start showing them a father instead of a ghost, they'll eventually grow up to look at you the same way your enemies do, as a target. The silence that followed was a physical weight. Naomi didn't wait for a rebuttal. She simply grabbed the compress and walked away, her footsteps disappearing into the plush carpet of the hallway. Seo-jun sat alone, the ice in his glass long melted. He looked at his reflection in the window, the sharp jaw, the scarred eyebrow, the eyes that Naomi had just stripped bare. He realized then that the most terrifying threat wasn't the Black Lotus or the assassins in the dark. It was the possibility that he had already lost his daughters before the war even began. He set the glass down and, for the first time in his life, walked toward the nursery not to guard it, but to see. The high-frequency whine of the silent alarm didn't make a sound, but it vibrated through the floorboards, a hum that Seo-jun felt in the marrow of his bones. Then the backup generators kicked in with a guttural roar as the penthouse was plunged into a red, pulsing emergency light. The power hadn't flickered, it had been severed. This wasn't a glitch in the grid, it was a surgical strike. The city of Seoul, usually a sea of lights outside his window, seemed to vanish, leaving the mansion an island of blood-red shadows in a rising tide of darkness. Seo-jun was on his feet before the first red pulse faded. His mind, honed by years of urban warfare, automatically calculated the variables. 6 guards in the hall, 2 at the service lift. Biometric locks should have engaged, but if the mainframe was dead, they were relying on mechanical bolts. His first instinct was to reach for the assault rifle hidden in the wall panel, but his eyes darted to the nursery, a cold, oily dread, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a low-level enforcer, slithered up his spine. He had built this cage to be impenetrable, yet here was the wolf already scratching at the door. He expected chaos. He expected the sound of a woman screaming in terror. But as he sprinted toward the nursery, he realized the air was eerily quiet, save for the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own heart. He burst into the room, weapon drawn, his eyes scanning for a muzzle flash. Instead, he found Naomi. She wasn't trembling, she wasn't huddled in a corner. She had Jia strapped to her chest in a professional-grade carrier and was lifting Jiwoo with a practiced, fluid motion. "Get away from the windows," Seo-jun barked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Already done," Naomi replied. Her voice was terrifyingly steady, a stark contrast to the frantic red strobe of the emergency lights. "I heard the secondary relay trip 3 minutes ago. I didn't wait for your guards to tell me what to do." 3 minutes? Seo-jun's jaw tightened. The internal sensors didn't even... "I don't need sensors to know when the air changes, Mr. Park," she interrupted, moving toward the bookcase that concealed the entrance to the safe room. She pressed a sequence of hidden buttons with a calm precision that floored him. The bookcase slid back with a heavy, metallic hiss. Seo-jun stared at her, the invisible woman who was currently navigating a tactical breach better than his elite security team. How do you know the sequence for the safe room? I never gave it to you. Naomi stepped into the reinforced steel vault, the amber nightlight from her sweater pocket illuminating the twins' wide, curious eyes. She looked back at him, her expression a mix of pity and steel. You're so busy looking for spies, you forgot to notice that I've been watching you protect them for 6 months. I didn't learn the code to steal from you, Seo-jun. I learned it so I didn't have to wait for you to save us. A heavy thud echoed from the foyer, the sound of the main door being breached by a battering ram. Seo-jun looked at the monitors inside the safe room, seeing masked figures flooding his home like ink in water. He looked back at Naomi, her silhouette a pillar of strength against the cold steel walls. She didn't look at the screens, she looked at him, her silent gaze demanding he do what he was born to do. Seo-jun gripped his weapon, the platinum ring on his finger glinting one last time before he stepped back into the red darkness. He slammed the vault door shut, locking his heart inside a steel box, and turned to face the ghosts of his past with a fury the Syndicate had never seen. The air in the penthouse smelled of cordites and expensive ozone, the aftermath of a night that should have ended in a funeral. Seo-jun sat at his mahogany desk, his knuckles bruised and his charcoal suit jacket discarded on the floor, stained with the dust of the breach. In front of him lay a burner phone, its screen cracked but glowing with a list of encrypted messages. It wasn't the assassin's blueprints that made his blood run cold. It was the realization that the most dangerous weapon in his house hadn't been a gun, but a choice. The battle was swift and brutal, his internal security finally catching up to the intruders, but the true revelation came afterward. While scrubbing the digital footprints of the attackers, his tech team had stumbled upon a secondary frequency, a series of outgoing pings from a device within the mansion. His mind immediately pivoted back to Naomi, the spy, the perfect silent infiltrator. He felt a sickening mixture of betrayal and twisted vindication. He had wanted her to be the enemy because it was easier to fight a traitor than to owe a debt to a saint. He marched to her quarters, ready to see the mask slip, ready to find the bag of cash or the offshore account details. But as he looked at the decrypted logs on the burner phone he had confiscated from a hidden floorboard in the pantry, the numbers didn't add up. There were no deposits, only refusals. Seo-jun threw the phone onto the nursery table, where Naomi was quietly folding the twins' sage green onesies. The metallic clatter was the only loud thing in the room. $6 million, Seo-jun said, his voice a jagged edge. That's what the Elder Council offered you to leave the nursery door unlocked last night. Why is the money still in their accounts? Naomi didn't flinch. She smoothed out a tiny sleeve, her dark mahogany hands steady. The first offer was $2 million. They went up every week for a month. I suppose they thought I was just haggling. Why didn't you take it? Seo-jun stepped into the light, his eyes searching hers for a lie. You could have disappeared. You could have bought a life far away from this blood. Why stay here and risk a bullet for a man you clearly despise? Naomi stood up, her honey-brown braids catching the morning sun. She walked toward him, not stopping until she was inches from his chest. I don't stay for you, Seo-jun. I stay because when the world comes for these girls, you're the only wall standing between them and the dark. But a wall doesn't love. It just stands there. She reached out, her finger brushing the jagged scar on his eyebrow. They didn't offer me money to kill you. They offered me money to let them take your legacy. And I realized that if I left, they wouldn't just be losing a boss. They'd be losing their father. I'm not a spy, Mr. Park. I'm an investor in a man I hope you'll eventually become. Seo-jun felt the weight of the debt settle on his shoulders, a burden heavier than any empire. He looked at the burner phone, then at Naomi, realizing she had been his most loyal soldier without ever swearing an oath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the private trust for his daughters. With a hand that still shook from the adrenaline of the fight, he wrote a single name into the guardianship clause, Naomi Rivers. He didn't say a word, but as he handed her the pen to co-sign, the look in his eyes changed. The Shadow King was gone. In his place was a man who realized that while he owned the city, he was currently being saved by a woman who owned nothing but her integrity. The sound was sharper than a siren and more piercing than a gunshot, the jagged, inconsolable wail of a sick infant. It was 4 a.m., and the penthouse felt like a pressurized chamber. Jiwoo's fever had spiked, turning her porcelain skin a frightening shade of flushed rose. In the center of the nursery, the Shadow King stood helpless, his bespoke suit sleeves pushed up to his elbows, watching the only thing in the world his billions couldn't fix. Seo-jun felt a primal, suffocating panic. He had navigated boardrooms filled with vipers and back alleys filled with ghosts, but he didn't know how to fight a virus. He looked at his hands that were trained to break, to grip, and to command. They felt like clumsy, leaden weights. On his pinky, the platinum signet ring caught the dim light. It was more than jewelry. It was the seal of the Park Syndicate. It had been pressed in hot wax on death warrants and kissed by men begging for mercy. It was the cold, hard symbol of everything he had sacrificed his humanity to build. Yet, as he watched Naomi desperately rocking the sobbing child, he realized the ring was just another piece of ice in a room that needed warmth. It was a barrier, a jagged edge of the world he brought home, and it was currently pressing into the soft skin of his daughter as he tried to help. "She won't take the medicine," Naomi whispered, her forehead pressed to Jiwoo. "She's exhausted, her micro braids slightly frayed, her usual composure wearing thin." "She feels your tension, Seo-jun. She feels the metal." Seo-jun looked at the ring. The heavy platinum crest was sharp, an emblem of a hawk gripping the sword. "It's who I am, Naomi. It doesn't just come off. It's who you were." Naomi countered, her amber eyes lifting to find his. Right now, she doesn't need a boss. She needs a father whose hands are soft enough to hold her without bruising. Without a word, Seo-jun gripped the band. It was tight, symbolically and physically, clinging to his skin as if it were part of his bone. With a sharp tug, he twisted it past the knuckle. He set the $1,000,000 symbol of his empire on the changing table like a piece of common scrap metal. "Hold her," Naomi commanded softly. The visual cliffhanger. Seo-jun reached out, his bare hand feeling strangely light, vulnerable, and exposed. As he tucked Jiwoo into the crook of his arm, his skin finally met hers without the interference of platinum. The baby's crying didn't stop instantly, but her small, feverish hand wandered up, her tiny fingers instinctively curling around the empty space on his pinky where the ring had lived for a decade. He froze, a lump forming in a throat that had forgotten how to swallow emotion. Naomi reached over, her hand covering both of theirs, creating a circuit of heat that had nothing to do with the fever. In that moment, the signet ring sat forgotten in the shadows, a discarded relic of a man who was finally learning that his greatest power wasn't in what he could command, but in what he was willing to let go. The night didn't break. It shattered. At exactly 1:14 a.m., the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse living room exploded inward, not from stones, but from synchronized sonic charges. The shock wave blew the heavy velvet curtains into ribbons and sent shards of billionaire-grade glass flying like diamond-edged shrapnel. Before the dust could settle, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of rappelling ropes hitting the balcony signaled that the Crimson Shadow had finally stopped sending flowers. The hunters were inside the house. Seo-jun was in his study when the glass screamed. Within a heartbeat, the Shadow King was back. The man who had sat on the nursery floor hours ago was replaced by a calculated killing machine. He didn't think about his art collection or his ledgers. His mind mapped the distance between the study and the nursery, 35 feet of open hallway that was now a kill zone. He felt a cold, familiar clarity. This was the world he had built, and now it was devouring him. But as he grabbed the suppressed submachine gun from beneath his desk, a new sensation pierced through the adrenaline. a jagged, white-hot terror. In every other war, he had been fighting for territory or pride. Tonight, he was fighting for the two small heartbeats at the end of the hall and the woman who held them. If he lost this ground, the Park lineage wouldn't just end, it would be erased in the dark. The hallway was a tunnel of smoke and strobing emergency lights. Seo-jun rounded the corner, his weapon barking as he neutralized two masked figures stepping through the shattered balcony. His earpiece crackled with the frantic voice of his head of security. "Sir, the service elevator is compromised. They're coming up from the vents. You need to evacuate to the roof." "Negative," Seo-jun hissed, hugging the wall as a hail of return fire chewed into the expensive plaster above his head. "The penthouse is lost, Mr. Park. Fall back." Seo-jun ignored him, sliding across the floor to take cover behind a heavy marble pedestal. He saw the nursery door at the end of the hall. Two attackers were already at the handle, setting a breaching charge. "Naomi, floor! Get them on the floor!" From behind the heavy reinforced wood of the nursery door, he didn't hear a scream. He heard the muffled metallic clack of a security bolt being thrown, and Naomi's voice, impossibly steady. "We're already in the vault, Seo-jun. Don't you dare die in my hallway." The breaching charge on the nursery door detonated, a fireball of orange and black that sent the heavy door flying off its hinges. Seo-jun screamed a silent oath, discarding his primary weapon and drawing his twin pistols. He moved with a lethal, desperate grace, charging into the smoke. He was a man possessed, stepping over the fallen, his eyes fixed on the gaping hole where the nursery door used to be. He cleared the threshold just as the final attacker raised a weapon toward the safe room door. He didn't think. He threw his entire body weight into the man, the two of them crashing through the wreckage. As they grappled on the floor, Seo-jun looked up through the haze. The safe room door remained closed, its steel surface scarred but unyielding. But then he saw it. The crimson trail of his own blood leading back toward the hall, and the red laser dot of a sniper's rifle from the building across the street dancing across the vault's keypad. He was the only thing standing in the way of the kill shot. He stood up, blocking the door with his own body, his silhouette a defiant cross against the red-stained darkness of the room. The silence of the safe room was more jarring than the roar of the explosion. Inside the steel-lined vault, the air was thin, tasting of ozone and the copper tang of fresh blood. Seo-jun leaned against the reinforced door, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The red laser that had been hunting the keypad was gone, but it had left its mark. A single high-velocity round had bypassed his vest, tearing through the meat of his shoulder and exiting near the collarbone. He sloughed to the floor, the dark fabric of his dress shirt soaked through, turning a terrifying, heavy black. Seo-jun felt the world tilting, the edges of his vision fraying into gray. For years, he had been the architect of other men's pain, viewing a wound as a tactical setback or a badge of ruthlessness. Now it was just cold. He looked at his hands, slick with his own life force, and felt a strange, detached sense of irony. He had built this vault to keep the world out, but he had dragged his own dying body inside, bringing the violence with him. He looked at the twins. They were huddled in the corner of the small space, tucked into a nest of blankets. They weren't crying. They were staring at him with those wide, hauntingly familiar eyes. He realized then that the price of the truth that he loved them more than his throne, was written in the blood pooling on the steel floor. He tried to speak, to tell Naomi to take the secondary exit if he faded, but his tongue felt like lead. "Don't you dare close your eyes," Naomi's voice cut through the fog. She wasn't hovering over him in hysterics. She was already moving. She had ripped open the emergency medical kit bolted to the wall and was laying out instruments with a terrifying, clinical precision. "Naomi, the girls, get out," he wheezed. "Shut up," Naomi snapped, her amber eyes hard as flint. She knelt between his legs, her hands moving with the speed of a seasoned combat medic. She bit down on a roll of gauze, tearing a strip. "I'm going to have to cauterize the bleeder and stitch the exit wound. We can't turn on the overhead lights. The heat signature might give the snipers a lock through the ventilation slots. We do this in the dark." Seo-jun let out a choked laugh that turned into a groan. Where did a cleaner learn to handle a trauma kit like that? Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of a single chemical light stick. My father was a doctor in a neighborhood where the police didn't like to go. I was his surgical tech before I was old enough to drive. You think you're the only one who knows what it's like to survive a war zone? She pressed a thick pad of gauze against his shoulder, and Seo-jun's world exploded in white light. Hold this, and stay quiet. If the babies hear you scream, they'll scream, and if they scream, we're dead. The next 20 minutes were a descent into a private purgatory. In the suffocating darkness of the vault, Naomi worked by touch and the faint, ghostly light of the chemistic. Seo-jun gripped the edge of a steel bench, his teeth grinding together so hard he feared they would shatter, but he didn't make a sound. Beside them, the twins remained miraculously silent. Ji-ya had crawled toward Seo-jun, her tiny hand resting on his boot, as if anchoring him to the room. Naomi worked with a fierce, quiet intensity, her micro braids brushing against his neck as she leaned in to tie the final suture. As she finished, she slumped back against the opposite wall, her hands covered in blood of the man she had spent months of ghosting. For a moment, they just sat there, the wounded king, the secret healer, and the innocent heirs, bound together by a crimson thread. The visual was a haunting tableau. Naomi, her face streaked with sweat and blood, holding a finger to her lips as she checked the twins, while Seo-jun watched her, finally realizing that his servant was the most formidable soldier he had ever met. The sunrise over Seoul was a bruised purple, the first light of dawn reflecting off the shattered remains of the penthouse windows. Below, the sirens of the city had finally faded, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic sweep of cleanup crews and the low hum of black SUVs idling on the street. Seo-jun stood by the edge of a balcony, his arm bound in a clean white sling, watching the world he had once ruled with an iron fist begin to wake up without him. The air was cold, but for the first time in 15 years, it didn't taste like ash. Seo-jun looked down his left hand. It felt light, uneerily so. The absence of the platinum signet ring was a physical ache, a phantom limb that reminded him of the man he used to be. For years, he had believed that to step down was to die, that the only way to protect his lineage was to stay atop the mountain of bodies he had climbed. But the silence of the vault had taught him a different truth. He thought of Naomi's steady hands in the dark, and the way Ji-ya had reached for his boot while he bled. They didn't need a king, they needed a father. The Shadow King had died in that safe room, bled out on a steel floor. What remained was a man who realized that a throne is just a lonely chair in a cold room, while a cradle is a kingdom worth every sacrifice. He was no longer afraid of losing his power. He was only afraid of losing the light in his daughter's eyes. The glass doors slid open behind him. Naomi stepped onto the balcony, her face washed clean of the night's grime, though her amber eyes still held the weary depth of a soldier. She held 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling into the morning air. "The council is waiting for your statement," she said softly. "They've been calling the secondary line every 10 minutes. They want to know who is taking over the northern territories." Seo-jun took the coffee with his good hand, the warmth seeping into his palm. "Let them wait. I'm sending a mass encryption at noon. I'm liquidating the front companies and handing the rest to my underboss, on one condition." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "That they never speak my name again. The Park Syndicate ends today. What remains will be a private estate managed by a board they can't touch." He turned to look at her, his gaze intense. "I'm retiring, Naomi, not to a beach and not to a hideout. I'm retiring to the nursery." Naomi let out a short, breathy laugh, her gaze shifting to the horizon. "A man like you, changing diapers and singing lullabies? You'll be bored in a week." "I spent a decade being powerful, and I've never been more bored," Seo-jun replied, a rare, genuine smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'd rather spend the next decade being a person. If you'll stay, not as a cleaner, as their guardian, and perhaps as the woman who reminds me who I am when I forget." Naomi took a slow sip of her coffee, her amber eyes reflecting the rising sun. "I'm not a servant, Seo-jun. If I stay, we're partners, in the house and in whatever comes next." "Partners," Seo-jun agreed, the word feeling more solid than any treaty he'd ever signed. Seo-jun walked back into the living room, passing the broken furniture and the bullet-scarred walls without a second glance. He reached the nursery door, repaired overnight by his silent, efficient crews, and pushed it open. The room was bathed in a soft, golden glow. Jiu and Jia were awake, kicking their legs in their cribs, blissfully unaware of the war that had been fought for their breath. Seo-jun sat on the rug, the same spot where he had first found Naomi sleeping. He reached out and picked up Jia, tucking her into his chest. As Naomi leaned against the doorframe watching them, Seo-jun looked at his reflection in the nursery window. The suit was gone, the ring was gone, but as his daughter laughed, he realized he had never looked more like a king.